So, Hugh, I got a question for you to kick this thing off. Oh, by
Right,
the
let's
way,
go. Hit me.
no, well, I'm tempted to be, hey, Hugh, what's the crack? Did I say that right?
No, when you say LPU, now when you say crack, like what do you actually mean by that? No, my actual response to that is I'm doing very well, Steve. It's lovely to see you.
Oh, God bless you. Yeah. No, here's my question. Have you ever been a gamer? Have you ever been addicted to gaming?
Yeah, that's a very personal question, Steve. I don't think I'm prepared to answer that in front
We
of our
try
millions
to
of listeners.
we try to avoid anything that smacks of self-disclosure, vulnerability, any of that really. So, you know what? Forget that. Let's talk about the NBA playoffs, shall we?
You know what? I'd rather talk about my gaming addiction than the NBA playoffs because I
Okay.
know nothing about the latter. Okay, so look,
Well,
yes, I think I don't know how much of this I've even shared with you, to be honest, but just to jump straight in here to start with, like not holding any punches. Like I survived a suicide attempt when I was incredibly young, and in the kind of Hollywood version of those stories, you're like, then everything magically got better, and I started my upward arc. And the reality was, I had about 5 or 6 years after that where I was really just in the belly of the beast, like fighting depression, had undiagnosed bipolar 2 disorder, and we'll get into all that stuff at a different point. But basically, I was looking for any drug that I could get my hands on to help me escape from my reality, and escapism was my drug of choice on the big picture kind of level. And I was born in 95, so I kind of fit snugly into that millennial category. I remember getting a Game Boy Gray whenever I was like 4 years old and playing the first ever Pokemon game on it. Pikachu was following you around, and that just lit me up. Like something about electronic gamified stuff just literally, it captured me the same way I hear people talk about an alcoholic describing their first drink. And instantly, I went from just kind of being like an ordinary kid to like staying up like most nights super late under the covers. It didn't have a backlight in those days, so you had to have like a flashlight attachment on top of your Game Boy. And that was my gateway drug. We got a PlayStation 1 then, and I kind of like, then we got internet in the house and computers, and so I was as much of a gamer as anyone could have been through the 90s and the early 2000s, and definitely was that kind of like stereotypical nerd. And I learned so much stuff through that season of my life that served me today. I'm very tech enabled. I have a tech enabled business, and I love technology, but I definitely experienced the shadow that sun can cast. And you'll love this because I know you're a man of data. So I remember working out just when I got married. So since I've been married, I have not touched a video game. Actually, even more extreme than that. Probably since I was 18, I haven't actually owned a console or been involved in gaming in some sort of way because it was such a big thing for me. But I remember at that 18 point working out how many hours I had spent gaming. Do you think you could ballpark? We'll play like higher or lower, okay? And don't lowball me here. Like,
Okay.
go for it.
Well, Malcolm Gladwell famously posited the 10,000 hour rule.
That's
and,
right.
to build world-class proficiency, which you have in the tech space. So I'm just going to go, I'm going to go with the 10,000 hour rule.
That is it's totally Steve. Like that has you all over it. It's a very educated guess. It's very, very close. So I worked it out. It was 12,000 hours.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
From the ages of, I think, 11 to 18. So that's in a 7-year period, right? And I Googled it before we started here. In days, that's 500 days of gaming.
Wow. Well, see,
as in like non-stop, like.
Can I tell you where my brain went? If you have a 40-hour a week job and you work it 50 weeks a year, that's 2,000 hours a year. So you're talking about you were putting in 6 years of full-time work.
Dude, I was like a miner clocking into the consoles every single day.
Yeah.
Did not miss, dude.
You think of all the vacation time you built, sick time.
Think of all the languages I could have learned. Believe me, I've been through this. I'm over it. I have acceptance now. It's part of me. I learned a lot. I'm glad it happened and all that sort of stuff. But in some ways, I think even though I'm much older than the demographic of individuals we're going to be talking about today, I kind of feel like I was Gen Z before it was cool because I was like a nerd by nature and because I was so interested in technology and an early adopter in that space, my upbringing was very similar to like what the typical, let's say, kid and teenager, so teenage years and younger, will experience growing up today, where there's games everywhere, there's consoles everywhere, you have screens in every single room of your house, in your pocket and whatever. But this was really novel and really new. Like, nobody knew how to deal with this at the time. We were the first generation that was forging this path, for better or for worse. And I have had to work through some of those hang-ups. I've had to work through some of those baggage. And as a result, I think I have some really interesting kind of tools and techniques that I still apply in my daily life. Because I also have some triggers I have to be really careful of, and I have to protect myself because it's so easy to fall back into old habits. But yeah, definitely this whole idea of escapism and running away from your pain, I think it transcends the generations. And you mentioned, I think it was some sort of weird indie punk band that you love, where they have that line where it's like, what's your drug of choice? And they're like, what have you got? I think all of us are looking for some sort of a drug, and for some of us gaming works, for some of us it's an actual substance, for some of us it's the list goes on and on and on. But
absolutely,
yeah, screens played a big role in my drug of choice.
Yeah, that's, by the way, the song is called Junkhead by Alice in Chains, if you're keeping score at home. And it's a brilliant song for that lyric alone, but there's a lot more wisdom there. Okay, well, everybody, thank you for that, Hugh, by the way. That was beautiful. Welcome to Mental Health, the show where we discuss the latest tools, ancient practices, and cutting-edge research to help you take back control of your emotional well-being. I'm Steve Ilardi. I'm a psychologist. I'm a professor. I'm a researcher. I sort of have some cred as a neuroscientist as well. Yeah, a little bit. Do some podcasting, do some YouTubing, do some writing. What else? Oh, NBA consultant.
You see, this is what you were doing with your 10,000 hours while I was playing Call of Duty and RuneScape and Pokemon and Mario Kart. Like, this is what you were clocking in.
I am profoundly grateful in many ways that I did come of age before these temptations were around. Mine was, honestly, though, I'm not even sure it was any better because, like, I watched my 10,000 hours of TV.
You were like the TV generation.
TV generation.
Yeah.
Which, if you think about it, is very passive. And we're going to take a deep dive. So let's stick a pin in this. We got to come back to the neurodevelopmental impact of 10,000 hours of TV viewing in childhood versus 10,000 hours of gaming, because there's some really interesting trade-offs.
It's all screen time at its core.
It's all screen time.
It's all kind of doing the same thing. Oh, dude, I'm loving this episode already.
I'm off. Diversion. So, there are lots of ways to waste big chunks of childhood. Okay, lots of different ways, and
what a heartbreaking phrase, but I'm bought in, man.
Yeah,
I'm so
yeah.
in.
Okay,
look, I'm Hugh James. I'm a writer and a podcaster from Ireland. I feel like I've already done my intro bit because I told you my life story there, but I've been on a journey of recovery from addiction, from depression over the last 15 years. Joined up with the superstar professor a few months ago to create this wonderful podcast experience and haven't looked back since. So yeah, we're really delighted you're here. We are doing a special Patreon Q&A episode today, submitted by a wonderful, wonderful listener, all on this topic. So I'm not going to say any more. We've already kind of teased it all out. So
let's hear it.
Welcome to our ears this wonderful question asker through the powers of technology. Let's see if my gaming chops can get me through this next transition.
Oh, that would be so ironic.
Hi guys, my name is Ryan Scullin, and I'm going to ask you a question around digital wellbeing. So I have a background working with gamers, and I think this gives me a unique insight into some of the mental health challenges that Gen Z are facing today. In the current climate, we collectively as a society are obviously spending more and more time hooked into these digital worlds. And with the metaverse around the corner, in my opinion, I think this is only going to get worse. Not to mention the global pandemic. So it's really no surprise that we are experiencing a mental health crisis right now. With all of this in mind, my question is, how do we better equip Gen Z to take care of their mental health? Thanks very much, guys.
Awesome. Yeah, lovely question, Ryan. Thank you so much for sending that into us. Really appreciate you. The one thing I'm going to say before I let you take stage here and give me your perspective as a clinical researcher. He talks about the metaverse. I don't want to get into the metaverse today because we can get into it another time. But in some ways, the metaverse is already here, and the metaverse has been here for a long time, depending who you're talking to. So if I spent 500 days of my life in my teenage years plugged in to a virtual reality, okay, I didn't have goggles, but that's what it was. I was escaping my reality. So I think for a lot of people who are listening or watching today, they already are part of this metaverse where we're hyper connected with all these screens. Our brains are plugged into all these different channels. Our devices have become like an extension of our brain. We already have kind of made that jump between human and technology. The hardware is just catching up. I think that's an Elon Musk thing, but anyway. Give me your perspective.
Well, I don't want to show you my messages here. Hugh, have we talked about the study recently where researchers paid teenagers and college students, Gen Z folks, to give up their cell phones for different windows of time?
No, but tell me.
Well, the first study that I read, this is a few years ago, but I believe it was a very modest aim of getting people to give up their cell phones for a day or two. And many of the participants, and I don't have the exact percentage, but I believe it was close to half, reported the kinds of withdrawal symptoms that people report when they're basically going cold turkey from heroin. Or, I mean,
oh my goodness,
like feeling really panicky, jittery, angsty, hyper aroused, startle response. I mean, just like crazy withdrawal. This feeling of incompleteness, this feeling of disorientation, like this device gives me my sense of constant anchoring to the world. And it's really rather extraordinary that we now have in Gen Z, the first generation that grew up with this smartphone device. And obviously, as you said, there were lots of other screens and devices that go back for years. But
again, like a focal point that I always kind of come back to when I talk about this sort of stuff is, I think for my 12th birthday, I got an iPod Touch, and that was whenever the first iPhone came out.
Yep.
So, yeah. Whereas now, my daughter now is growing up in a world where everybody has a smartphone,
And they start, probably with like a tablet, like an iPad or something when they're 2 years old, and they're already interacting with this
Shout out to Peppa Pig.
that they're carrying around. And a lot of kids now, at least in the States, and it's probably true in the UK as well, are getting their first smartphone while they're in elementary school. So, maybe 8, 10, 12 years old. And they have this device with them constantly. They take it with them to bed. It's the first thing they look at when they get up in the morning, last thing that they interact with at night. And we've mentioned her before, but the psychologist, researcher Jean Twenge dubs Gen Z iGen, the iPhone generation, and has meticulously documented the fact that their mental health is alarmingly worse than the mental health of any preceding generation. The rates of clinical diagnoses of depression, anxiety, addictive behaviors, and insomnia, psychoactive medication use, just absolutely staggering. The epidemic of teen suicide. We've talked about many of these things before, but Twenge has these beautiful graphs, which I wish we could show folks, but you'll just have to take my word for it. You can look her up online, where she shows that the alarming rise in teen mental illness almost perfectly tracks the uptake of smartphones among this generation, growing up with them in childhood, having the brain wired up with this 24/7 sort of, metaverse influence. And what are the screens doing that is so destructive to mental health?
Because I think intuitively, and again, we always go back to grannies. I always joke my next book is going to be called Granny Was Right, and then it's going to be here's the neuroscience research of everything your granny said, blah blah blah. But she intuitively knew. She would come in and she'd be like, "You need to get out of your pit. You need to open those windows. You need to get those curtains open. Let the light come in. You need to get outside. You shouldn't be on this so long." And if I turn on and be like, "Why?" She couldn't give me a clear answer, but something in her gut was saying this is not okay. So
Yeah.
I'm now excited to hear why actually this is not okay.
Well, so many reasons, but the thing that most of the research is kind of hitting us in the face with is the idea of opportunity cost, which is a fancy economics term for like, hey, if you spend your money on this thing, then that means you can't spend it on these other things, right? So there's an opportunity cost. If you buy a new shiny new iPhone 13, then that's $1,000 that you don't have to spend on groceries or whatever.
Yeah, so if my 12,000 hours, instead of becoming fluent in both German and French.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly right. Or instead of having that wicked crossover dribble like Kyrie Irving, right? Because some people put in their 10,000 hours out on the basketball court when they're 8 years old. So what is the opportunity cost of these devices that we have constantly, but that Gen Z has had constantly since they were really small? Well, there's the opportunity cost of impaired sleep, for one thing. Why? Because we find that so many young people take their phones. In fact, you mentioned taking your gaming devices to bed with you when you were
literally from let's say 4 years old, 5 years old,
and
with the akimbo flashlight because it didn't have a backlight. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, I find this really fascinating, but kind of shocking. How many of my students who are right there in the middle of Gen Z have no idea that their developing brains genuinely need like 9 hours of sleep a night optimally to be thriving. 8 hours is okay for most people. We'll take the deep dive on the essentials of sleep for sure. But the TLDR is sleep is the time in which our brain cells get replenished, they get a pit stop, and all of the toxic metabolic byproducts that build up from the average brain cell fires 10 times every second, all day long, 10 times while we're awake, 10 times every second. So thousands and thousands of times throughout the day. And they're building up all these waste products. You got to take out the trash. You got to get that stuff out of there, and you got to replenish them with fresh supplies. That's what happens during sleep. And we need a lot of it, especially when we're young, just so the brain can be hitting on all cylinders. And so many young people are getting like 5 and 6 hours a night instead of the 8 and 9 that kids used to get. I mean, parents used to, basically, it was just a given. It was part of the manual that they would hand us as parents. No, there were some manuals, but the manual of like, hey, if you're going to be a good parent, you've got to carve out all this time for your kids to sleep. We still do it often with little kids. Why? Because we can see immediately in their crankiness or they're acting out, like they're having meltdowns when they're 2 if they're sleep deprived. Well, when
also
they're 10,
you need a little bit of time and space for yourself.
Well, yeah, I wasn't going to go there, but yeah, absolutely. But when they're 10. You don't see the meltdown so much, but what you see are symptoms of ADHD and symptoms of anxiety and symptoms of crankiness and depression even, and suicidality. And instead of parents connecting the dots and saying, oh, wait a minute, like I think our kids are in bed or in their bedroom long enough, but it's like, oh no, they're actually staying up on their smartphone for an extra 3 hours after they go retreat into their bedroom. And so instead of getting, 9 hours, the kid's getting 5 or 6, and everything is suffering. And by the way, Gen Z grew up not even knowing that they needed this sleep. Why? Because nobody was getting it. I often find it absolutely stunning when I'm teaching courses like abnormal psychology or personality psychology or other courses for undergrads, and I'm giving them this information, very matter of fact, very, I would say, in a pretty academic sense, but also somewhat applied. And I get these reflection papers and I get emails and I get students coming to office hours all the time saying, this is freaking life-changing information. Like nobody ever really explained why sleep is important, how it's important, how I'm not. And they're starting to carve out enough time. And they're like, this is a performance-enhancing drug. This is like the lowest of low-hanging fruit to make your life better. If you're sleep deprived, which most of Gen Z is chronically sleep deprived, and you start getting adequate sleep, it's life-changing. And
Yeah, it's crazy. Like something I always go back to is I remember doing a trip overseas. I'll just say it. So spent some time in Nepal and we spent some time hiking.
Oh wow!
And
In
I went with a
Nepal?
whole bunch of like so up the
Flying to
Himalayas,
Kathmandu and then trek up to
Kathmandu, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I was with some like super elite, high performing New Yorkers because I lived in New York at the time, and they were all kind of big dogs in their own right. And they were all kind of like, I get 4 hours of sleep a night, and that's enough to do me because I'm just da 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 da.
Yeah.
We were up there, and I can't remember exactly when the sun went down, but let's say 9, 10 o'clock at night, and didn't come up again for another 8 hours. And these dudes, after like 2 nights, because they didn't have anything with them, there was no form of stimulation other than like the campfire banter, I suppose you could say. And these dudes, for the first time in like 20 years, were getting 8, 9 hours of sleep, and they were feeling incredible. And I've experienced this time and time again when I go camping, and it always surprises me because I do sleep quite a lot. I need, my 8 or 9 hours. But see, even like the times where I'm intentionally taking time away from screens, I sleep more than ever because yourself, it gets to like 8 o'clock at night and you're not tired. You're maybe a little bit tired. But if you like do something kind of low stimulation, or you're even like playing a board game, or you're reading, or you're spending time with friends, once 9 o'clock comes around, or once 10 o'clock comes around, like you're really, really tired. Whereas with screens, if you plug yourself in at that kind of like landing the plane moment of your day, it like fires you up again, and you can go for another like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours without ever feeling tired. And so I totally get what you're saying, where it's not even that we are intentionally running away from our sleep. It's just that these screens that we're connecting ourselves to, they help us erode and blast through our natural barriers that our body's trying to set us. It's like an artificial stretching off that, isn't it?
Yeah. So what other opportunity cost is there? Well, one of the really big things that I've been focusing on is screen time replacing face-to-face time. I used to say screen time replacing FaceTime, but
but
yeah, that
they already beat you to it.
That didn't work so well. So screen time replacing face-to-face time. The University of Chicago has an organization that puts out something called the General Social Survey, where they ask the same questions of a random stratified sample of Americans year after year, decade after decade. So you can, kind of track social trends. And they have one survey that goes out to high school seniors. So they're graduating high school students, 17, 18-year-olds. And one of the questions asks, how much time in a given week are you spending? And I think maybe they do it day by day and then, aggregate over a week. How much time are you spending hanging out with your friends? And I was absolutely dumbfounded to see that I looked up the year that I graduated high school, which, was back in the Pleistocene era, but let's just say it's a few decades ago. And
horse and cart era. Yeah.
It was and of course we were walking uphill 5 miles and through snow, uphill both ways.
Exactly. Not to completely derail the conversation, a little kind of like rain on America's parade for a second. When I first moved to America, my roommate asked me, do we have YouTube in Ireland? He asked me, do we have iPhones in Ireland?
Nice.
And then a day later they asked me like, do you guys still like use like horses to get around? And I was like, I'm done. Like, I am absolutely finished. Someone on the subway once complimented me on my English, saying that my English is just so good. And
that's
even though I'm from Ireland, and I was
like,
dude, thank you so much. Anyway, the year you graduated high school,
that was when
how many hours were people hanging out?
Forgive me.
You have to reply.
But if I had been you, I would have dropped whatever Gaelic I knew. I would have just like spoken Gaelic for the next hour, just for the hell of it. So my high school cohort a few decades ago was spending literally over twice as many hours a week hanging out with our friends as the current. And by the way, this study I saw it like 5 years ago, so God only knows what it is post-pandemic. Let's just say far less than half as much time. I mean, that's staggering. And so what's happening? Phones, texting, and just social media, it's taking the place of real life. And our brains and our minds are designed for in real life. And there is if you think about the richness of our experience of somebody else face to face in person, where we're getting all the nonverbal cues. We're getting, if they give us a hug or, give us a fist bump.
You mentioned physical touch in a previous Q&A and like how important that is.
Oh, yeah.
You're not getting that over
you're not,
Xbox
no,
Live or whatever people do these days.
And you don't know this about me, but, being from an Italian family on one side, I mean,
Are you a hugger?
I'm a hugger. Yeah, I know that's not an Irish thing so much, but yeah. My son-in-law is not a hugger, so we do a little fist bump, and he's cool with the fist bump.
That human connection. It still sends the neurons flying, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And so if you have a generation that is impoverished with its feeling of connection and feeling of belonging as well, which is a little different, and we'll take the deep dive on connection versus belong, but belonging to something bigger than ourselves. And there are a lot of pale substitutes for that feeling of being in the tribe, being richly immersed in physical community. Kids will go to a concert or something and they'll get it. They're at a concert and they're surrounded physically and they're all singing and they're chanting and they're moving and they're swaying and they're entranced. It's like an ancient worship service or something for a couple hours. And it's like a transcendent, epiphanal experience. And they're like, why can't life be like this all the time? And it's like,
I'll dilute that immensely here, okay? You can get a very, very low dose of that feeling, that same sort of sense of community and belonging, say, whenever that really crazy moment happens on the subreddit that you're a part of. Or maybe in the Xbox Live, group or whatever it is, you can tell how out of touch I am already with things like this. I'm speaking stuff about the early 2000s, 2010. But you get the idea. There are digital imitations of that, but they are exactly that. They are imitations, and they pale in comparison to the full flavor.
Absolutely, and like anything that's addictive, and screens certainly have that behavioral addictive property. Gaming has that behavioral addictive property. It has the ability to give us that, if I can just say it the way, you hear it in everyday conversation, the little dopamine hit. Or as a neuroscientist would say, to light up our reward pathways, to activate our reward pathways a bit.
I knew you couldn't just let that slip.
I can't just say the dopamine.
I was like, there's no way he's just going to let the little commonplace dopamine hit, without the full.
That's for the hoi polloi. Not for... Okay, so we get our little dopamine hit from the game, but it's nothing like... honestly, it's like the difference between just pure junk food and a substantive, nourishing, delicious meal that gives us all the nutrients that our body needs and craves versus, I just had this candy bar. It's like, okay, well, the candy bar, sure, it was fine. It tasted good. It got you through the moment, but you don't want to be eating candy bars all day. That's what Gen Z sort of neurologically is doing. They're just eating the candy all day long, and they're not getting adequately nourished. And, if somebody literally just ate candy all day, every day for a few years, pretty soon we're not going to be surprised to see their health suffering.
Okay, so let's move into kind of I think we've done a good job of exploring the issue. We've kind of mapped out a few ideas around it. Let's get into the tactical bits now. So, Ryan asked, what can we do to help?
Yeah, well, let's talk about it.
How can we walk alongside Gen Z to equip them with the tools that they need to basically thrive and keep their mental health in a really strong and robust way? Yeah,
well, so, that's part of our mission for this podcast is providing, among other things, a set of mental health toolkits or the tools that are in a single toolkit, providing the kind of foundational features of our life that we can stack on top of each other. So what are we talking about? Adequate nutrition, which we've begun to explore. There's a lot more there. Habits of healthy sleep, which we'll be having a deeper dive on soon. Habits of movement and physical activity. Habits of being outside rather than inside and getting adequate sunlight and getting vitamin D synthesized in our skin and getting exposed, believe it or not, to probiotic, healthy, friendly microbes when we're outside. We're literally breathing in probiotics when we go outside in nature.
Give me a go, okay? MBK?
Mycobacterium baccae, VACCAE.
I was so close,
Baccae. No, Baccae, you are a very, very...
I'm a student of the master. Come on, we've been doing this for a couple of months now.
Can I brag on you for a second, Hugh?
Oh, you can take 10 minutes.
Hugh is in he doesn't talk about himself this way very much. Hugh is in a PhD program. One of the reasons why I think we're such good friends is he is the writer, the poet, the literary maven. I can write a little bit, but not like this guy. I'm more the scientist, more the academic, but he is in a PhD program of literature. He will be Dr. freaking Hugh.
Oh yeah,
next May.
This was the Dr. Steve show. This is
it's
the
Dr.
Doctor show.
Oh, dude, I don't know what we're gonna have. We're gonna have to do something.
Dude, on a plane, whenever someone's like, "Is there a doctor here?" I'll be like, "Yes, of literature. How can I help you?"
It's like, I've been reading Foucault and Derrida. I'm very confused. I'm having an existential crisis related to my deconstruction of reality. Please help me out, Dr. Hugh.
Oh yeah, I see it all now. It's gonna be good.
If the pilot is having an existential crisis, and can't land the plane, you're there for him. So
yeah, I'm there for anyone who's having existential.
Absolutely. So we are building out a mental health toolkit for any listener, but I think especially what I've noticed in my teaching over the last 25 years is uniquely Gen Z. So we're talking about, for folks who are a little confused, demographers would say those who are probably about 25 and younger, they did not grow up with a given, a baseline default assumption that these really robust, powerful habits are going to be important to integrate. And the other thing that so many of my Gen Z students have told me is it blows their mind when I present the neuroscience of how all of these things change the brain. They change brain signaling, they change brain chemistry. So it's like, hey, you want to change brain chemistry? Get outside in sunlight. You want to change brain chemistry? Get your body moving. You want to change brain chemistry? Quit eating junk food and start getting the nutrients that your brain is craving.
Dude,
get healthy.
So far in the toolkit, we've talked about omega-3 and like the huge impact that can have on your brain. We just did another toolkit episode where we talked about light as a drug and how it's like one of the most potent and powerful things. So beyond like everything your granny would tell you, like, eat well, exercise, and sleep, there are some really powerful and natural things that Gen Z can be deploying here that they just don't know about because, okay, maybe like granny gets that stuff because she grew up on a farm and so much of it was naturally baked into her life organically. But for us as modern individuals and as the next generation growing up in this kind of metaverse, as Ryan alluded to, we have to go out of our way to get the same things that our ancestors would have got naturally.
Exactly.
And I think that's the challenge, but also the great opportunity.
Absolutely. And just to be motivated by the knowledge. Knowledge is power, right? And I think for so much of Gen Z, there's this sense of, okay, I've been told since I was little that I have a chemical imbalance, because I have ADHD, because I have anxiety, because I have depression, because I have an eating disorder, because whatever, I have a chemical imbalance, so I've got to take drugs. Well, the drugs haven't really helped that much, but I guess, or I don't like the side effects. I don't like the way they make me feel, but I guess. And for so many of the Gen Z folks that I talk to, when they're presented with the idea that, hey, you can actually have some agency in this collaboration with your healthcare providers, there are things you can take control over that will affect your own brain chemistry. And it's so empowering. It's a tricky little needle to thread to help empower somebody without giving them a sense of guilt, without giving blame. It's like, no, you're not to blame if you have unhealthy habits. There's no cause for guilt, but there's a cause for great hope because we can begin to make these little changes. In whatever way you can, at whatever level you can right now, if you just start with what you can do right now, it will make a difference. And there is usually a sense of momentum that happens. We've used the metaphor of the snowball rolling down the hill. It starts very modest, it's like, is this really making much of a difference at all? But over time, it really can. And for many of us, really, really does. So
absolutely. That's cool. Look, I feel like we could honestly, like, the answer to this question is actually just like, go back and listen to like the 30 hours we've put out.
Oh, I love it. That's a great answer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
because that is, as you said, this is what the show's all about. And the same tools that work for a baby boomer are actually the same tools that work for Gen Z. we all share pretty much exactly the same like genetic code and ways of being. Oh, yeah, sure, that's an oversimplification, but the things that work for humans over the last 2,000 years are going to work for you. And so it's learning and discovering what those things are. I mention it every episode, and I've no shame in doing so. Like, Steve has an amazing book called The Depression Cure. The subtitle, wait to hear this, 6 Steps for Overcoming Depression Without the Use of Drugs. And it is all based on that ancestral dynamic that we've been talking about. But I do want to end this episode by specifically giving some actionable stuff around screens, because I do think that is perhaps something that Gen Z faces more uniquely and chronically than other generations.
So Hugh, is this the segment we like to call Hugh's Hacks?
Dun, 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 dun.
Oh, we got to have some theme
Hugh's
music.
hacks.
Yeah. maybe. Yeah, I don't know who's going to be doing it. You mentioned, by the way, earlier in the show that you were nerdy by nature. They're the hip hop group Naughty by Nature. It immediately came to mind when you said that. I was like, oh, hip hop, hooray! Yeah, we could do a little I don't know what kind of royalties.
Nerdy by Nature. I appreciate that.
Nerdy by Nature is like whenever you take the stage to do some hip hop, mental health.
Oh
hip hop.
And exactly, that's the niche. It's like when we move into the hip hop space, it's gonna be
Nerdy by Nature.
Nerdy by Nature, mental health kind of scene. It's funny, like we joked in a previous episode, I'm wasting so much time here, that Inflamed on the Membrane track we were going to do. I was driving home from the gym the other day and I was thinking about the title in my head and I was like, it's going to be called Inflamed on the Membrane and then like hyphen a diss track on Omega 6. It's just beyond niche. It's like no one will ever watch this, but I'll enjoy making it. Okay, so Hugh's Hacks. It's the segment on the show where I throw out some things that have really worked for me. They're dead easy. Well, they're dead simple. They're actionable, and they're stuff that you can apply literally by the end of this episode and put them into your daily life by tomorrow. So the first thing I will say as like the big overall umbrella statement here is that we are no match for technology. And that sounds kind of very like fatalistic and whatever, but like in my experience, and especially in like a post-social dilemma era where all the research is there, we have all the information. What we knew in our guts has been proven to be true time and time again, and that is that these things are just way too powerful, they're way too addictive, they're way too strong for us to handle by ourselves. And so the best way I've found to protect myself from technology and the shadow side of it is by just setting good boundaries. So I'll give you an example, okay? So physical boundaries, like actual physical things that you can do. Something that's been a big game changer is establishing screen-free zones in your house.
Okay, you got it. Yeah. But I want you to unpack that because, I think so many people don't. I'm just going to hold this up one last time. So many people don't appreciate that literally thousands of the smartest minds on the planet. Think about all the brain power that a generation ago was poured into like, oh, how can we explore space? How can we leverage? How can we crack the human genome? How can we do all this amazing science and technology? And now it's how can we get people to become addicted to this device and the apps that run on it and basically capture their attention and keep it? What is the ball game of this device and the economics that drive it? Capturing people's attention and holding it, whatever can keep you locked in. And if you have that much brain power dedicated to getting you addicted, trust us when we tell you that they're not messing around. They're really good at what they do.
These are the big guns, man.
These are, we've
got a little hunter-gatherer, like flint tipped spear, and they're coming in with the big guns here.
And there's no shame in acknowledging that they have learned how to hack our brain. Just like we've talked about in a previous episode, every addictive drug hacks into the brain and takes it over for the addict. It's, now the addict has been co-opted. It's almost like the drug is a parasite that's taken over the brain's motivation center. Well, your phone, your devices are basically like a parasite. And unlike the drug, which has no consciousness or agency, no, the people behind this smartphone and these other devices, they know exactly what the hell they're doing. I'm not saying they're evil. They're trying to make a buck, right? They know that there's billions and trillions of dollars to be made capturing your attention, turning you into an addict. And so, yeah, that's what we're up against.
A screen-free zone is basically, it's a practice of digital amputation.
Oh,
so,
dude, that sounds painful.
Yeah, it is painful because as the study you mentioned earlier, like we have a real dependency on these devices. My general rule of thumb is if the device is there, you're going to use it. There's just no way around it. Like, I don't care if you have the willpower of insert somebody who has a lot of willpower, because I can't think of anybody.
Odysseus tied to the mast.
Odysseus.
Not really tied to he didn't have the willpower. That's why he's tied to the mast.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Screen-free zones, the place I recommend you experimenting and starting off with, because it's the easiest and the most effective, is to turn your bedroom into a screen-free zone. And I know that is that's going right for the jugular, but remember back to what Steve was saying, your sleep is so important. Your mental clarity and that little bit of cognitive bandwidth at the end of the day is so crucial. And if you can have even I'm not even going to prescribe an hour here or a time, but if you can just make your bedroom free from screens, that will get you 80% of the way there. And I know that's a big claim, but it's genuinely, it's one of those classic 80-20 principle things where it's a small step you can take that will have a giant effect. Second thing I will say, another boundary. So we talked about physical. The second is temporal. I was struggling for a word there. So temporal is in a time boundary. And these are where you establish screen-free zones in your schedule. So this is kind of the harder bit. Again, the easiest place to start, I would say, is 1 hour after you wake up and 1 hour before you go to bed. If that's too much for you, go 30 minutes. And start to stretch that out. Start to experiment with that. I'll just give some examples of things you can shoot for. They're not necessarily things you can apply right away, but you could go for having a screen-free day, probably on a weekend, maybe a Saturday or a Sunday if you work a typical work week, where you can really unplug from the stresses of work. You can unplug from the stresses of the constantly being connected, always having to get back to stuff, always having to reply. A screen-free day or even a screen-free morning is a lovely boundary in time that you can set that will have a massive impact. Third type of boundary I want to talk about is emotional. And so what I will say on that, just to keep it really short, is a simple question. If you've been addicted to anything, you know this dynamic. When you're using something, you know in your heart of hearts if you're using it for fun or if you're using it as some sort of a self-medication. And so for me with screens, I am, believe it or not, pretty open and pretty relaxed whenever it comes to some aspects of this. I have no problem watching a movie. My wife and I, we watched a couple of episodes of a really funny Irish sitcom called Dairy Girls last night. And we loved it. We had a blast. It was super fun. But before I went into that, I did a quick little check where I was like, am I using this as a form of escape right now? Or am I using this as just a super fun bit of entertainment that I'm doing in community with somebody else? And that's another really important filter to run your actions through. Is this interaction with screens taking me away from community, or is it bringing me closer to community in some sort of a way? And if it's isolating you, that's just a place that as humans, we've never really been safe doing. So I would always throw in that wee caveat as well. And the last thing I'll say for today, because we could talk for literally 3 years on this subject, is a new thing. Well, it's a new phrase that I've been using. We talked about screen time earlier. We talked about FaceTime. And part of these screen-free zones in your schedule yourself a little bit of paper time, because paper time is so awesome. A really simple and personal example of this was, I work a 4-day work week, which I'm really fortunate to do. And I'm glad to see so many other businesses moving that way based on the research. But, Friday mornings, I then would do kind of a quick last minute roundup of the week. I would clear the inbox. I would, sort the Google Calendar for next week. I just found, man, that was opening up the work box in my brain and causing me to be just as stressed and overloaded as any other work day. And so I just made the decision where I was like, you know what? I can still do that, because you do need a bit of time to prep and plan and organize your life, but I'm going to do it on paper. And the difference was so astronomical. I'm sure there's research on this, but paper for me just unlocks a completely different part of my brain. I was problem solving in a way that there's no way I would be doing if I didn't have a pencil in my hand. It's so tactile, it's so physical. There's something so nice about that.
Yeah. It's tapping into some of the sensory motor circuitry of the brain that makes it much more of a integrative processing, whole brain experience that, I mean, this is going to sound kind of corny, but when we're thinking with a pen and paper, when we're writing, it's a whole brain experience. It's a whole self experience in a way that just tapping on a keyboard, that's a much more sort of frontal cortex disembodied, or at least not fully embodied experience. And most of us really need to get back inhabiting our full bodies with everything we do, with our whole self. And, as our ancestors did. And, they didn't have the disembodied. That's what, I mean, if you really want to know my take on the metaverse, it's like, oh, great, let's get people even more disembodied. Yeah, that's going to end well. What could possibly go wrong with Web3? But yeah, so anyway.
And like a really simple like variation of that, again, that's quite new to me. Like I've been a Kindle man for so many years, and just like, over the last few months, I just said like, no more. Like I spend my whole working life on screens, like, and I love them because they enable me to do the type of work that I do. But like, I'm going back to paperback, man.
Yeah.
Like, I'm getting some paper time in over the weekends and at nighttime, and there's something so different about having that physical copy in your hand. It changes the experience, and I think the more paper time we can put in there, and look, branch it out. This is, we're talking about gaming as well in this episode. Like, gaming is not just bound to a digital capacity.
Board games. They're making a comeback.
Is a form of paper time, dude.
They're making a comeback. Yeah, Gen Z is into board games.
Yeah, and so you get to stimulate that same part of the human brain that loves games and loves competition and loves, exploring and playing and all that good stuff. But you do so without some of the potential hang-ups that the digital stuff can bring. So yeah, look, I know that I've been very disciplined. Even whenever I was prepping this episode, I was like, I could talk for 2 hours on this, but I'm just going to do this because it's a Q&A episode.
Brilliant.
And who knows, maybe we'll do some sort of a screen time 101. We can talk about Odysseus because I have a lot of stuff to say on Odysseus, but I held back today.
You talked about Odysseus in your TEDx talk.
I did a TEDx talk on screens on Odysseus, and look at me, I didn't even get into it. So there's a little bit of something to dangle for the future.
I love it. That's so beautiful. By the way, quick shout out. We talked a lot today about Gen Z. Millennials, pretty much, you could just substitute the word millennial for almost everything we said, except for the part about growing up with smartphones from early childhood. Everything else fits. And I would say most millennials that I know, that I've treated, that I've worked with, that I've taught, they've had a lot of the same struggles. So pretty much anybody under about 40. And by the way, a lot of us who are of a certain age, which would be far beyond, I'm pushing the outer boundaries of Gen X, right up at the edge of okay boomer. I'm not quite, thank God. But, a lot of us in Gen X can also really identify with a lot of this because our brains have been co-opted as well.
I'm running late for my dinner, but I have to ask because we teased it at the start and you just reminded me. Talk to me about early child development stuff around screens and screen time, television. You had something to say there, and I want to hear you say it.
Yeah, no, I've got nothing. Literally, I was just saying out loud, it would be so cool to do the deep dive in the research and see.
It's a potential area to explore. This is even better.
And I suspect there's some really good published work in this area. I'm just not a developmental psychologist, but I love going into different research areas and seeing what's there, what's been published. So it's like, hey, there's a rabbit hole. We love chasing down rabbit holes here on the Mental Health Podcast. If you all haven't figured this out, both Hugh and I are, we're rabbit hole junkies.
Serial rabbit hole adventurers.
Yeah. And so I want to dive down the rabbit hole. What does it do to the developing brain to be putting in the 10,000 hours of passive TV time versus active gaming time or, interactive internet time, whatever that is going to look like? And it's a little bit of a different thing from the social media angle, right? Which, adds a different layer. We know, and we'll unpack that. We'll definitely do a social media deep dive because of the toxicity that ensues with social interactions that are built around I'm being constantly evaluated based on what I've just put out there into the world. Now it's all, get this, folks. Can I just give the quick take? I know, Q, you got to go eat. TLDR on social media, it's performative rather than connective. It's performative.
Ooh, that was worth the dinner getting cold.
Thank you.
Woo!
Performative rather than connective. We're going to come back and unpack all that at a later date. Hugh, go and enjoy your family, your dinner. I'm going to go ahead.
One last thing, as we like to say.
Patreon. Yeah, go ahead.
Even before that, like, just a call out, intuitively now, and a lot of millennials and older Gen Zers that I know who have kids, intuitively in our guts, we're trying to do something different and create a different environment for our kids where we're like, maybe we want to be a little bit more intentional with screens than perhaps we were kids.
Yeah.
And so I would love to see the findings of that research, because, like, you know, kind of like what we said about Granny, like having that feeling in her gut. We now, as the next generation, have that kind of feeling in our gut. We're like, probably not the best thing for young people. We don't know the research on why, but we're going to just be very intentional about how we go forward with that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for being here. As Steve already alluded to, you can support the show on Patreon. There's a link wherever you're listening to this episode. It's on our YouTube, it's on our Spotify. You can go to the website mentalhealth.fm. We are a 100% crowd-funded show. We don't have any sponsorship. We do not take ads on the show, because we believe in providing this content for free without any editorial strings attached to, you know, really pursue our goal of reaching people around the world who are struggling or have someone in their life who's struggling with a various type of a mental health disorder.
But we get such a warm, toasty feeling inside whenever anybody...
Are you trying to create a dopamine hit for the listener
listen,
here? What the heck?
If somebody can afford $1 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month, if this content is of any value and you want to help partner with us so that we can make this available to other people that really might need to hear this, think about joining us. I know times are tough for a lot of folks. Hugh, have you heard there's inflation happening in our world right now?
The reason why I love the crowdfunded model is if you don't have the means or the desire, this show will always be here.
Exactly.
For you. It'll always be free. If you have the means and the desire, we would really appreciate your support. And that's it. That's this very, very soft sell. You don't need to go in hard.
Amen,
the
brother.
model's ethical, you know. We didn't even get on the social media bit, but, you know, like, I've been in the content space for probably 10 years now, and, you know, because of my early entry into the space. And I love the crowdfunded model. I love supporting my favorite creators on the crowdfunded model because it's just ethical. It makes better content. It means that people don't have to make questionable choices for the sake of a few extra clicks. And ultimately, it's a way for small creators like us to continue doing what we're doing and reach an audience that hopefully will value what we're doing. So, yeah, Steve, I value your time and I value your input today. So, lovely seeing you.
Right back at you, Slick. That's a Seinfeld.
Okay, close to being the edge boomer.
Oh, this has been a hell of a lot of fun, as always. Probably too much fun, as you said last time. Everybody, as you can tell, we're so grateful to be on this journey with each of you. And till next time, be well.
See ya.
Peace out.